You're watching The Sports Objective, the podcast for Pirates.
Welcome into the debut episode of The Coach's Kid on the Sports Objective podcast channel. Join me, Bubba Rosenbaum, and Kyle Barber on Monday nights at 6 o'clock as we'll have a conversation with a coach's kid. When you're a coach's kid, there are definitely many unique opportunities as well as plenty of challenges that come with that lifestyle. It is often a transient one. You're in the public spotlight where your parent is often subjected to unfair criticism, and many consider it to be just a game. But for the coach's kid and their families, make no mistake about it, it is a way of life. With each passing year, there is more money involved, and consequently, the pressure to win now is greater than ever before, particularly in certain sports at certain places, be it the high school, college, or professional level. Before we bring in our initial guest, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Kyle Barber. Kyle, how are you this evening?
Doing well. Debut episode of this. Excited about it and excited to have our first guest starting off in a big way.
Yeah, no doubt. One of the best college football coaches ever, undoubtedly, Bobby Bowden, nearly 360 wins, 357, I believe, to be exact. Many of those coming at Florida State. And right now, very excited to be joined by one of his sons, Tommy. Appreciate you joining us, Coach Bowden.
Well, glad to be on yours. And this is your initial show?
We've had a podcast for 5.5 years or so now,
Okay.
but this show specifically, The Coach's Kid, it is the debut episode. Yes, sir.
Well, you picked a kid from the winningest family and probably college, maybe coaching all. I think my father had 357. Terry had about 100, got about 150 and still going. I think I had 90. So 600 wins in the Coach's Kids family, which is probably, I don't know if it'll ever be matched.
No doubt. Unbelievable, that Bowden name and what it's meant to the college football world. So I'd say, take us back there early in your childhood. I know your dad had played at Howard. And then I think initially, before he and your mom, Ann, got married, he had accepted a scholarship to play for the University of Alabama. Is that correct?
And they were married when he went down there. They eloped and got secretly married, came back. He lived with his parents. She lived with her parents. And, it's hard to keep stuff like that quiet. So people finally find out. I think Bear Bryant had a policy, or Alabama had a policy, you couldn't be married. So he went to back to Howard, which is now Sanford, and finished his career, and then really just about started his coaching career there.
Yeah, no doubt. So what are some of your earliest memories of your dad during those years? I would imagine probably it came at what is now Sanford at Howard College.
Yeah, those were my earliest memories of him being a coach. Us kids, we down the end zone. I remember playing during the game. They had a hill we used to play on and slide on, and I remember making some trips with him on a bus, and we would sleep up in that luggage rack. They got the place up above the seat where you put your luggage. And of course, we're probably 4 years old, 5 years old, and there's a bunch of us. He let us sleep up there in them luggage racks, make away games, going away games with him. But that was my first memory when he was at Howard College as the head coach.
Coach, how old were you when he went to Florida State for the first time and became wide receivers coach?
He went there in 1963. And I believe I was probably about first grade. I was probably around 6 or 7 years old. And stayed there he ended up staying 3 years before he went. A guy named Bill Peterson was the head coach. But he coached quarterbacks and receivers back in, I think, 63, 64, and 1965 before he went to West Virginia in 1966.
Now, his first tenure at Florida State, obviously Florida State wasn't what they were going to become, but it was obviously a step up from Sanford. As a small child, elementary school, did you realize that at the time that he was coaching at a bigger school?
Yes, no. Obviously, the size of the stadium at Florida State was bigger at that particular time, probably 30,000, not a whole lot bigger than what Howard was. But I knew it was a bigger platform, but I was really too young to understand the significance of the Howard to Florida State jump. He was coaching the quarterback receivers, a guy that you might remember named Fred Bolitnikoff was a receiver that he coached, and they had a quarterback named Steve Tenzie. I think played Oklahoma in the Gator Bowl. I think won, and then he left and went to West Virginia. But I remember it, but not being that significant of a jump simply because of my age and not knowing that much about the profession.
Right.
So when you guys moved to Morgantown in the mid-'60s, talk about that transition, and I guess that was during your early middle school years, is that right? Or
Yeah.
late elementary?
Yeah, they had something called junior high up there, which were 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. I started my 7th grade year up in West Virginia. Ended up staying up there through my junior high school, played college there for 5 years. I was redshirted, but he was there for 10 years. And I remember going to the games. I was, in high school and junior high, walking to the games, sitting up in the stands. And of course, not as much pressure. He was offensive coordinator. They were successful. They won. A guy named Jim Carlin was the head coach. And then really understood a little bit more about the coaching profession, the pressures, the stress, once he became the head coach in 1970.
What was it like growing up, being a teenager in a college town? You probably, I'm sure, got to interact with the players who were a little bit older than you while you were playing high school ball and junior high ball. So what was that like?
Still was not around the college environment that much. I wasn't a guy that went up there and practiced and hang around. I was playing, high school track, high school football, some baseball. So, I had other things to do other than hang around the stadium. I remember going to the games, and especially once he became the head coach. But it really, West Virginia, of course, at that time was not a significant player on the national scene. So it was kind of a job until he became a head coach and had a losing season, and they hung him in effigy. And I started playing on the team when we would actually call. I remember one time they called a players only meeting without the coaches. I was on the team, and players criticized my father, practicing too long, too much hitting, bad play calling, things typically that guys 19, 20 years old talk about coaches around. But I remember sitting in meetings where the players were critical of my father. Then, of course, he turned around and had success. But I remember the more significant as I became a player in college and then understood a little bit more about the pressures and some of the criticism comes with it on a public fashion.
Now, go ahead, Bob.
As you mentioned, that 1970 season, your dad's first as the head coach at West Virginia after 4 years as the OC. That was the year of the horrific tragedy with Marshall. Your dad was portrayed in that 2006 release, We Are Marshall. What are your memories of that tragedy with the fallen 75?
Of course, I remember it very vividly because it got so much national attention. It happened there in the state. The airport in Huntington was very similar to the airport in Morgantown. They just take the top of a mountain, bulldoze it off, and you better land on that mountain. You better not be short, you better not be long. But the most significant thing I remember about that, the movie was very accurate, the way he portrayed my father and the relationship he had. But a lot of people don't realize that about maybe a year before that, he was actually offered that head coaching job at Marshall and turned it down, or he would have been probably on that plane when it crashed. But I remembered it was a huge story in the state of West Virginia.
I was going to follow up more on that, Coach, and you say you remember it, and you was your dad's first year head coach. In the movie, it is portrayed that he teaches Marshall's head coach the triple option, and Marshall installs it. Was that accurate? Did they come learn the triple option from your dad?
Yeah, that was. I think my father, he got it somewhere. I forget, maybe Texas or might have been Emory Ballard at Mississippi State. The guy that was the head coach Mississippi State at that time was involved with some split back veer or some option football, and it was kind of new up in that area up in the Northeast. But he shared information with Marshall, opened up the film room to him. to them. And when they came up in the movie and met with my father out there, it looked like a lobby, and he set them up. That was very, very accurate as far as how that happened. So that was all true to form.
Yeah, that was. I love that part of the movie, just the camaraderie there that you see between coaches, even rivals there in the same state, and during tragic times like that, extending a helping hand. And so, as you were wrapping up your high school career, talk about that decision to stay there at West Virginia in Morgantown and play for your dad, as opposed to maybe going off and playing elsewhere.
Well, at that particular time, I've been married 47 years, and I've been dating my current wife all through high school, and I probably had a little bit of my father's DNA. I didn't want to get too far away from her. I didn't have a lot of options. I wasn't very big, 5'9", 150 pounds. I walked on at West Virginia, but I think I had a couple of smaller school offers. But I decided to stay there, try to walk on at West Virginia. My current wife was in school. She's a year behind me, but she went to high school with me, West Virginia. I didn't want to leave her, so it was pretty easy decision when that was taken into as a factor.
During that time, I believe your final year at West Virginia was in '76, correct?
Yeah, correct. A guy named Frank Signetti followed my father, and I
Right.
played. I started my last year in 1975 at wide receiver when we went to the Peach Bowl and beat NC State. Lou Holt was the head coach. And then I stayed one more year. I had a redshirt year. My father went to Florida State. I stayed and played for Frank Signetti, and then started my coaching career under him.
Right, and that's where I was going with that. That I knew your dad was at Florida State from '76 to '09, so I knew your final year had been
Right.
played for Coach Signetti. So what are your memories of that? Of course, now, and I'm trying to remember if it was the late '70s or early '80s when the current stadium at West Virginia, Milan Puskar Stadium, Mountaineer Field, was built. But what are your memories of that old stadium?
Oh, it's just a great place to play. Horseshoe Stadium, I think it's seated maybe 35,000. The thing I remember about it is the fans were right on top of you. There might have been 10 yards between the first row of bleachers. We had a little bit of wall, and then the playing field. And I can remember being on the sideline, my father being right there. I mean, just right in front of you, and the fans right behind you, and right on top of you. Fortunately, when I played, we had a lot of success. So it was a very pleasant experience because we had success the year that I started anyway. Now, the year before, 1974, is the year they tried to run him off, and he about got fired. But 75 was a great experience. The biggest thing is the fans were right on top of you. It was down by the river, very scenic. You can kind of overlook Monongahela River, and very rabid fans. They weren't burning couches back then, but it was still a very enthusiastic crowd.
Coach, I wanted to go backwards a little bit, and then we'll move back forward. But just briefly, we skipped over your childhood kind of fast. So just generic question here for you. Just kind of talk about what your dad was like as you were growing up as a small child. Say the ages between 5 and 15. Those adolescent years. What was your dad like? What was it like having him as a father? I know it's a very broad-based question. What was his temperament like? What did he expect out of you as a student, et cetera? All that kind of stuff.
Well, I had 5 siblings. My father and mother had 6 children in 10 years. So they're all packed in there pretty tight. Girls on the ends and the 4 boys in the middle. And my father being a head coach at such a young age, we didn't see him very much. My mother was a disciplinarian, and she pretty much raised all 6 of us. The profession just demands so much from a time standpoint. You don't have much family time, and he didn't spend a lot of time with us, but the time that he did was surely quality time. Being a Christian myself, was a very godly man, and that's one of the things I learned as a player. I probably coached with him about 4 years, played for him, and I can't ever. I can remember he cussed about 5 times, and I can remember the situations. It was such a few times. So with football being such a very emotional, enthusiastic, very intense sport, a lot of coaches, their language gets carried away. But the things I remember him as a coach, when I was a player and as a young coach, when I would come home from high school and they would either lose or win, it was very balanced personality, very balanced demeanor. A lot of that was his faith. Football is so demanding. He always felt, and I felt, that you needed some kind of stability. The ups and downs of football, the public criticism, the stress, the pressure, the anxiety. You needed some kind of grounding, some kind of stability, some kind of central figure in your life. And for us, that was a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's one of the things I learned. You can win in this profession and be a strong Christian. His Florida State teams were just cold-blooded, they would kill you. And I'd like to say my father's teams played from the Old Testament, but he lived love, grace, mercy, forgiveness from the New Testament. When he played, when he coached, it was Old Testament. And but that's probably one of the biggest things I learned. It really helped me going into coaching. Hey, you can win and still have a strong Christian faith and demeanor about you on the sidelines and how you handle your team, practice, and you can get kind of mad at them, but there's a way to do it.
You mentioned your father's faith and him being a very even-keeled man most of the time. And one thing Bubba mentioned the other day as we were preparing for the show is he remembered watching the Bobby Bowden coaches show or the Florida State coaches show, whatever it was called at the time. And Coach Bowden would always say things like, he would reference a player and then reference his mama making the best, pot roast or apple pie or whatever. And just talk about that. Him being able to remember kids' parents and what mama made. And was that one of his, particularly back then when things were a lot simpler, was the kind of man he was that the biggest thing that was able to get him in recruits' houses before he started winning at a high level?
Yeah, I think it was. He's with him, what you see is what you get. And he was very personable when he went into homes recruiting. And he realized, like a lot of coaches do, most coaches do, to sign a scholarship, one of the parents have to sign. And there's so many single parent homes and young men raised by their mother. You better love up on her, and you better get her in your corner. And he would always mention their names or their parents' names. And my first year as a head coach, when I went to Tulane, I got with my TV guy when I did my show. He said, listen, I want every player's mother's name. And don't give me the wrong name now if I mention it. Boy, he stayed up all night before our first show researching every mother's and father's name. They had two parents. I mentioned them both. A lot of them have one single parent and would mention them. So that's one thing I learned from him. I think that really helped him until he started winning. And then when he started winning, he along with his personality and his relationship with family, and it was a pretty deadly combination. 14 top 5 finishes won't be beat, never NCAA record, but that combination of things you just mentioned, the relationship with the family, recognizing the mother and the father, their importance in their son, and then mentioned on TV. A lot of them, these small West Virginia homes and small rural communities in South Georgia, Panhandle of Florida, which is very conservative, rural. For them to hear their name on TV was a big factor.
Kyle referenced your father's impact during your adolescent and teenage years. So when you were making that decision, what you wanted to do with your life professionally after wrapping up your career at West Virginia, talk about any conversations you may have had with your dad as far as, is coaching something that you knew you had known for a long time that you wanted to go into, or was that something you were kind of tossing around different ideas?
I remember I had to write an autobiography, I think in 6th or 7th grade, and I wrote in that autobiography that I wanted to be a college coach. More or less because my father was a college coach. Had he been a banker, I'd probably gone to banking. Had he gone to any other business, CPA, I probably would have done that. He'd been a high school coach. I'd probably been a high school coach, but he was a college coach. And I wrote a paper early in my career. But I remember one thing he did. He did not encourage or discourage us from going into coaching. He understood the demands and the stress on a family and how difficult a profession it was. And I remember one thing he said, if you can live without it, don't do it. And that's the kind of advice I had from him. I knew early I wanted to do it. Plus, me and Terry, who went into coach, our brother Jeff, we were kind of spoiled. We sat there and saw one of the best ever, arguably one of the top 5 coaches or top couple in the history of at least Division I football. We saw how he did it. He had success, and I think a lot of times we might have been under the false illusion that we could have that same kind of success, as we watched him do it in every facet of his life, behind closed doors, on the practice field, in the locker room.
You talk about, maybe having a false illusion, you and your brother Terry, that you could have the same success. And you had success. You had the undefeated season at Tulane. You had a number of great seasons at Clemson. What was it like always being, I don't want to turn anything negative, but, it had to get to you at some point, always being compared to your dad.
It really didn't, because it took me a long time to get a head coaching job. I said, man, why can't with my father's name, why can't I get a head coaching job? I saw other guys get one. I had coached at Alabama, coached at Auburn. I've been a young coordinator at 29 at Duke University, and been a coordinator at Auburn, been a coordinator at Kentucky. I said, man, I cannot get a job. So when I finally got one at Tulane, I didn't really that they hired me with those expectations of doing what my father did at Florida State at Tulane. But one of the things I think that really helped Terry and I have success early, which my first year I won 7 at Tulane, which they hadn't done in 17 years. The next year undefeated, which they haven't done since, is because, and Terry went undefeated his first year at Auburn. I think we felt very confident, Terry and I did, about how to get it done. How to deal with the media, how long to practice, how much hit to do, how to handle staff morale, how to handle discipline on players, game preseason preparation, summer preparation, spring. We had a guaranteed plan of success. So, and then Terry had success early, and so did I. So there wasn't like any kind of pressure. Hey, we had 4 or 5 losing seasons in a row, and said, hey, we hired you to be like your father. Terry and I both went undefeated before my father did. As far as he went undefeated in 1980, but he lost the bowl game. Terry went 11-0. I went 12-0 and winning the bowl game. So really, we had success early in our career. So that pressure that you just mentioned really wasn't a factor. Then when we got to playing, when I got to play my father, it brought a different kind of pressure. But there really wasn't that kind of pressure when we went into coaching. Then Terry and I both had success early, so that kind of eliminated that comparison.
Coach, I'm going by this off memory. I don't have this in my show notes. Your Tulane team that went 12-0. It was BYU in the Liberty Bowl that year. Is that right?
BYU in the Liberty Bowl, beat them pretty significantly. And but we ran the table undefeated. Terry ran the table undefeated. My father went undefeated in 80 and lost the bowl game. He didn't go undefeated until I want to say 1999. I think that's the one where he went number 1 from straight from first week to all the way through.
Yes, sir. Beat Michael Vick and Virginia Tech for the national championship. If Bub, is there anything you want to get in before we get into the Bowden Bowl?
I was going to talk about that stretch, and it kind of overlaps that, but then you can dive into the Bowden Bowl, Kyle. But the stretch there from the late 80s, early 90s, 14 consecutive years where Florida State was ranked in the top 5. Just what an unbelievable run.
Bub, it was really top 4 when you get it. I'm going to ask you and Kyle a little trivia question right here. Right now, father had 14. Who is second behind him? There's 3 teams tied with 7 top 5 finishes. You know who they are? 3 teams?
I would say one that would immediately come to mind, just kind of from that same era. I would guess. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. It can be any time, in the history of
right. Oh yeah, yes sir. I know you weren't. But I would say just this guy so happened to be rolling during those years out at Nebraska. Tom Osborne.
Nope, that's not one. Nope. Kyle, you got a guess?
Oh man! What was the exact trivia question again? I'm sorry.
Top five. My father has 14 top five, or really top four finishes. Who is number two right now? If you Google who would number two be?
Paterno?
And there's three teams tied at number two, each with 7.
Okay, Penn State and Joe Paterno.
No, Penn State is not one.
Okay, Bama.
No.
Wow.
I have another one. I have another one in mind, but it may. I'm not sure if he was there 7 years because he moved on to the NFL. But Jimmy Johnson in Miami.
No, but Miami is one of the schools. They have 14.
Okay.
He was
Okay, so we're asking schools, not head coaches.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not head coaches, the school. So he got
Miami.
Who you know who the other two would be? Now we'll get off this. Southern Cal, and Oklahoma. Southern Cal and Oklahoma.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We would
once you drop out of the top 5, you got to start over. That's why Alabama, Clemson, you would think would be Ohio State. So once you drop out, Alabama dropped out a couple of years ago. So that record, by the way, I don't think will ever be beat. Not so much, of course, like you said. I don't know if Southern Cal's, Miami's, and Oklahoma's is the same coach. Barry Switzer, it might be, but my father, not only is it the same school, but it's the same coach.
Hey, that's incredibly impressive. His run at Florida State.
Yeah, those two don't surprise me. I was misunderstanding there. I thought we were guessing coaches.
Yeah, it's school. But anyway, we can go on something else.
We would eventually got there, Coach. I would have just kept naming schools.
Hey, we ain't got a 3-hour show for y'all to keep guessing.
So, Coach, we move on here. Obviously, during your time at Clemson, always marquee matchup. I can remember so many times ABC or ESPN watching the Bowden Bowl. What was that like for you and your dad and your mom? I mean, just from the whole family perspective.
Well, I found out quickly after that first year. He won the national championship in '99 when I played him. We were ahead 14-3 at halftime. He ended up beating us 17-14, but all my family deserted me after that game. I'm and everybody else. They all went with Florida State. Of course, my mother was sleeping with the head coach at Florida State, so she had to root for Florida State. He had the credit card, but he won the first 4. Then I won the last 4 out of 5. But that first one, first time in the history of football, father and son had played. Of course, he was number 1 in the nation. ESPN televised at night, nationally televised game, and is a great game. But the one thing I remember about that game is my sports information director came to me before the week before we were playing Georgia Tech. He said, "Listen, I've got so many requests from the media. You're going to have to do some of these on Florida State before the Georgia Tech game." I said, "Man, that's deadly curse. You definitely don't want to be talking about Florida State before you play another opponent. They see it as disrespectful." But there was so much media at that game, and I remember the week before I had to do Florida State media questions 2 weeks before we played them, and then before the game, talked to my father on the field, like that picture kind of shows right there. Just a massive amount of media around us as we met at midfield before the game.
What was it like beating him for the first time you won the Bowden Bowl? I'm sure it was a big honor for you, but it probably also had to be a little bit bittersweet.
Well, it was, because at that particular time, the first year I beat them, they were number 3 in the nation. Probably another chance to win a national championship. And I remember us beating them, I forget what the score was. It might have been by 10 points or something. But I remember, because I didn't realize Clemson had not scored a touchdown. Not a touchdown versus Florida State in 10 years, with 5 trips being to Tallahassee. In 10 years, they hadn't even scored a touchdown in Tallahassee. So beating them was a big deal. They were the Alabama or the Clemson or the Ohio State or Michigan, whoever's best in the Big Ten is right now. But they were dominant back then. So to finally beat them, it just gives you a little more credibility. You're allowed to recruit against Florida State in the state of Florida. You can go down and recruit and say, "Listen, you don't have to go to them, but we've just proved we can beat them." So it really opened up a lot of doors from the recruiting standpoint. Plus, gives you a little bit more credibility, your program more credibility nationally.
Yeah, I actually remember that. That's tremendous stat you just referenced, as far as not scoring a touchdown in all those years in Tallahassee at Doak Campbell, and obviously some tremendous defenses. That goes without saying with Coach Mickey Andrews, but that's an unbelievable stat.
Yeah, it kind of scared me. I wish my sports information director wouldn't have told me they hadn't scored a touchdown down in 10 years. Doesn't make you feel real good with a lot of. I remember the time we scored a touchdown in Tallahassee, we thought we won the game. Got beat pretty bad.
Coach, what was it like? Your dad retired. Was it 09 your dad retired?
09, I left Clemson halfway through 2008. It was a year or two after I left. I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, Kyle. It was
80.
It was 09.
Okay, it was
Yeah.
09. Okay. So what was your dad and your relationship like after he retired? Did he enjoy retirement? It was, he coached so long. I remember, and if you want to talk about it, sure. If you don't, that's fine too. It didn't really feel like he went out on his own terms at Florida State after all those years.
No, that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, I remember going down there and watching him prepare for University of Florida his last year. And I remember sitting up in the stands with him. His defense stay on the practice fields. The offense would go in the stadium and go through their script on a Thursday. And I can remember sitting up there talking to him, taking notes, watching the offense, taking notes up on the 50, about halfway up. He said, son, I got to meet with the AD Monday. I don't think it looks very good. And I'm thinking to myself, I turned around and looked at those big 20-foot letters that said Bobby Bowden Field and that statue out in front and what he had done. I said, I'm thinking to myself, there's no way they can fire you. They can't fire you. You only want 1 year with what you've done. And sure enough, they fired him a couple of days after that. So yeah, it didn't end the way he wanted. He just wanted 1 more year, but they didn't see the same value that he did.
No, it was ridiculous. I remember it very well, and I think everybody, maybe outside of some Florida State fans and some boosters, felt the same way, that it was a huge dishonor to your dad and what he had done, building a program not from scratch, but essentially from scratch, and certainly turning them into a national power that they were not before he got there, and not letting the man go out on his own terms, giving him 1 more year, a farewell tour, if you will, was just ridiculous. But
And Kyle, very quickly on that note, while you're talking about what was built there in Tallahassee, you look at the evolution of that stadium, Doak Campbell Stadium, when East Carolina played there in the early 80s, and what it became with the being bricked in, and it's unbelievable. From having exposed beams, much like Dowdy Ficklin.
It's the largest brick. It's the largest bricked structure in the state of Florida, I believe.
So, Coach, talk about your dad, post Florida State retirement. Obviously, he had tons of grandkids by that point. I think 20 grandkids, if I'm not mistaken. You tell me if
Yeah,
I'm
I think maybe 20 grandkids. He might have had 11, 12 great grandkids. And he didn't know names, but he'd play with them. We'd have big family vacation. He'd play with each one about 10 seconds and go get another one, go get another one, go get another one. Kept him pretty tied up. He's a big golfer. He loved golfer. Probably played 36 holes a day up until he was probably in his early 80s. Then he went to 18 a day up until he was 88. But he's a big golfer. I remember playing a lot of golf with him once he got out of coaching. And he lived on the golf course in Tallahassee. He always had to be doing something. He'd take that little golf cart he had and go out there and chip and putt, and go up to the country club, go down there and chip and putt, always doing something. But he didn't like golf. He loved to golf. And after he spent a lot of his time afterwards playing a lot. Then does a lot of Christian coaches. There is not a coach alive, any sport, male or female, of his stature. Now I'm talking about his stature that has done more Christian. I'm gonna call it Christian. It's not, we're Christians. We're not any other religion. But there's no coach alive that's done more Christian speaking. He really felt like he was called to do that. So he and I did a lot of speaking together, which was a great pleasure and joy for me. We did a lot of speaking together and traveled together once he got through with coaching. Playing golf and doing speaking. There's not a church in the Panhandle of Florida, state of Florida, Alabama, Georgia he probably hadn't spoke to. But that's what I remember once he got through coaching.
So it sounds like to me, just from doing this interview with you, that I'm sure you took a lot from your dad, but it sounds like the biggest thing you took from your dad wasn't coaching, it was his faith.
Yeah, because if you would have seen any of the funeral services, they had about 5 services, but the big one in the convention center when Warwick Dunn and Derek Brooks and Charlie Ward and Deion Sanders got to speak, it wasn't so much, boy, that great win we had against such and such and this and that. It was all about the character building and his faith, and I thought that was a great legacy to leave for him. But to see those guys hear those guys stand up and talk to him more as a Christian godly influence as opposed to coaching, and he was one of those rare guys that did them both. He was a strong Christian man that won a whole bunch of games, and they're far and few between. Dabo Swinney, Mark Rick's out of it now, and there's other Christian coaches. I don't know him as well as I did back when I was coaching, but he might have been the best ever of that combination.
Obviously, Coach, for the majority of your life, I started to ask, some of those major holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, you were preparing for games, and all that sort of stuff. But those holidays, once you and your dad were no longer coaching, what are some of those major holidays like in the Bowden household? And obviously, is that when I think of myself, in some of those major holidays, it always involves football, whether it's talking or watching. So, what's a major holiday like in such a household as yours?
Well, and you mentioned you kind of hit the nail on the head. A lot of people don't realize that. They say, "Well, what were your Thanksgivings and your Christmases like?" Well, I was playing my opponent, either South Carolina or some kind of rivalry game. Even I was coaching Alabama. We were playing Auburn. If I was Auburn, we were playing Alabama. My father was playing University of Florida, so we didn't have Thanksgivings together. Christmas, well, if you're not in a bowl in this profession, you'll be fired. I was bowl eligible every year I was at Clemson. My father was always in a bowl, so we didn't spend Christmases together. Our big family vacation in July at the beach, we went for 1 week. We had we went for like 51 or 52 straight years down to Panama City Beach, Florida. It went from his 6 children to their spouses and grandchildren, grandchildren, grew to about 50. Those were the things that I think most of my family, my nieces and nephews will all remember, is those family vacations. It wasn't so much Christmas, because I have my grandsons now. They come to my house for Christmas, and even when I was starting my family, my kids came to my house as opposed to me going to my father's house late in his career. So we didn't have a lot of Christmases together. A lot of Thanksgivings. The family vacation we had in July for 50 some years was the biggest gathering of family that we had. It was very influential to a lot of us and family and a lot of my nieces and nephews.
Coach, as we start to wrap this up, just if you will, if there's a quick funny story about your dad, something that might make everybody laugh, that comes to mind, and what is something some people may not know about your dad? Interesting fact.
Most people that follow his career know how strong of a Christian he was. His record. Just going back to that Bowden Bowl just briefly, I remember we played 9 times, and they were, for 2 Christian coaches, they were cold-blooded, knockdown, drag out, kicking, fighting, biting, hitting late, cussing. I remember I was very disappointed he couldn't handle his team any better than that. I was just surprised that they weren't more disciplined. But I remember after losing the first 4, my AD called me and said, "Listen," he said, "we hired you to beat Florida State. You can't beat your father. We'll find somebody that can." And that kind of got my attention. So I won the next 4 out of 5. And his AD called him in and said, "Listen, we hired you to beat Clemson. If you can't beat your son, we'll find somebody that can." So the more they fired us both, and that was the end of the Bowden Bowl.
Yeah, as former East Carolina head coach Steve Logan says, generally speaking, more often than not, football ends badly, and
That's
we'll
a
wrap
shame,
up.
but you're right. Joe Paterno, it didn't end the way he wanted. Matt Brown at Texas didn't end the way he wanted. I don't know if Tom Osborne even ended the way he wanted Nebraska, but
Right.
I know that, of course, Urban Meyer at Jacksonville Jaguars didn't. Steve Spurrier coaching the pros, Nick Saban at Miami. They bounced back. But you're right. In this profession, you best be prepared to handle the ups and the downs.
And Coach, we'll close with this. as I mentioned in the open, just the impact, that such high stakes has on a coach's family. Obviously, you were in those trenches as a coach yourself, but maybe through some conversations that you had with your sisters or otherwise, just being aware of what it's like to be a coach or son of a coach, and just everything that goes on, such pressure to win. What would a piece or two of advice be to coaches' kids out there that may be struggling with that? Because not all go into coaching. Some choose to lead less public life. Some because they're a doctor, teacher, whatever.
Well, one thing about the coaching profession, you choose to do it. You don't have to do it. You could do something else. And I think the biggest thing is educating your wife and your children that there's public criticism, and be prepared for it. That's one thing my father handled well. Of course, he didn't get a lot of public criticism because he won so many games. But when he did, late in his career at Florida State and even at West Virginia, when they hung him in effigy in 1974, and they voted, I think they voted 3-2 to keep him. The president gave the deciding vote to let him stay at West Virginia, and he won in 75. But the biggest thing is preparing your family for the public criticism, and it's an education process that I witnessed firsthand through my mother and through my siblings with my father. So it was really helpful. And then the other thing, we've touched on it a good bit, but to me is having something bigger than football. And that's a relationship with Jesus Christ, and a grounding and a stability and some kind of foundation that's bigger than the sport itself is helpful, regardless of what you go into. That's helpful in business, marriage, raising children, aging parents, whatever it is. So that would be the biggest things I took from my father.
I wholeheartedly agree. Very well said. And again, I really appreciate the visit. That will do it for this initial episode. You've been watching The Coach's Kid on The Sports Objective. Be sure to follow us on social media at The Sports OBJ on X, at The Sports Objective on Instagram and TikTok. Like and follow our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also reach us via email at thesportsobj@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, and if you have a coach's kid you'd like for us to get on the show, just let us know and we'll do our best to make it happen. For my co-host, Kyle Barber, and our initial guest, Tommy Bowden, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time on The Coach's Kid. Take care, everyone.